Members of the jury, you've now heard all the evidence. And what you've heard are two very different pictures of what the Deans and Lear family was like, about the household and environment that Nicole Nachtman grew up in. The state tried to paint a picture, and I emphasize the word tried, of a happy home in Carrollwood that involved a roof, a pool, shelter, food, material things. But the picture that was painted and supported by the evidence was that of a very different environment. The accurate picture that was painted during this trial, documented by family members, documented by teachers and school psychologists, testified to by people who encountered Nicole Nachtman in college, people who saw Nicole on a daily basis and made observations throughout her entire life. And the accurate picture that was painted in this trial is an environment that was riddled with abuse, primarily psychological abuse, which impacted Nicole Nachtman and led to her developing a severe mental illness. What we ask is that you ask yourselves these very two important questions. If everything was so perfect as the state has tried to suggest these past 2 weeks, then why are we here? Ask yourselves this question. Do happy and perfectly normal children, teenagers, college students, wake up one morning and decide, I'm going to shoot my parents today for no reason whatsoever? Does that make sense? Happy, loved, developed teenagers, college students wake up one morning and say, you know what, I'm going to execute my plan as the state wants you to believe and shoot my mother and my stepfather for no reason whatsoever. What caused this happy, fun-loving child that everybody testified to in this trial, even the state's witnesses, to go from this? During jury selection, Ms. Holt emphasized the importance of not formulating any opinions or conclusions until you heard all of the evidence. Each and every one of you were promised or were selected because you promised her you would do that. The state told you in their opening statement that when this case began, that Nicole's mom was providing her everything. Room, board, college, computers. And so because Nicole Nachtman just didn't want to face responsibility, she shot her mom. Members of the jury, if it was that simple, we wouldn't be here. If it was that simple, you wouldn't have sat through 2 weeks of testimony and evidence. Now, the state did acknowledge in their opening statement that Nicole Nachtman did not have an easy life. But what the state has refused to acknowledge through this entire trial is that Nicole Nachtman was not a normal college student. The state has made every attempt to paint this perfect picture that just isn't supported by the evidence. Despite what the state attempted to show you in their case, you've now been provided with the entire picture of Nicole Nachtman's life. A childhood that began with a custody battle, turmoil between her biological mother and biological father. A childhood that ended with her being ripped at the age of 3 from her biological father and never having contact with him again until she was arrested. A child who at the age of 3 not only gets ripped from her biological father's life, but at the same time, and why this is important, Joseph Carey runs away. Remember, Nicole Nachtman's 3, Joseph Carey is about 15, and they're 12 years apart. Now again, the state made every attempt to minimize what running away is. I even think Mr. Terry asked Joseph Carey, well, you didn't really run down the street, right? You just got out of the car and left. He left the state of Virginia and moved to Florida to be in the comfort of his grandmother, his uncles, and the family that loved and supported him. He left his school in Virginia. He left his friends in Virginia. He left his mother with the stress and turmoil that was surrounding him at that time. He told you, I ran away because my mom was divorcing my biological father, and the custody battle between Ronald Nachtman and my mother had become unbearable. That's what he told you. Guess who else he left? His 3-year-old sister to fend for herself. At the time, his brother Kevin was still alive. Because remember, Kevin doesn't die until 2003. The brother he said he was the closest with, they were a year apart in age. And Joseph Carey felt the need to get out of that house. He never went back. He told you he stayed in Florida with his grandmother until he graduated from high school, and then he joined the military. That is not the perfect environment the state has tried to suggest. We can get into word games about what the word runaway means, but I think the evidence speaks for itself. Joseph Carey, at the age of 14 or 15, made the conscious decision to leave his mother's home and never go back. Why is that important? Because Joseph Carey never lives in the same house again with Nicole Nachtman and their mother after she's 3. He's not in the home when she's 4. He's not in the home when she's 5. He's not in the home when she's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old. And then in 2003, when Kevin dies, Nicole is literally by herself with her mother. So what did Joseph Carey tell you about his mother? She was tough. She would belittle us. She would say her children are a disgrace to her. She constantly focused on Nicole's weight. She fat-shamed her. She made her get liposuction. Despite the fact that every single person who knew Nicole her entire life said she was never overweight. To him, those weren't a big deal, because that's just how mom was. He wasn't there every day. But members of the jury, you're not here to interpret how Joseph Carey may have interpreted his mother's actions. You're not here to determine whether Joseph Carey was physically or psychologically abused. You're not here to examine how Miriam Deans' actions affected Joseph Carey. You're here to determine how they affected Nicole Nachtman. I anticipate the state's going to get up here and tell you Nicole wasn't beaten every day. Neighbors never reported yelling or fighting. The police were never called. She never had to go to the doctor. Even Dr. Heidi told you, this isn't the worst case of physical abuse that I've seen. But what did she say was the definition of psychological and verbal abuse? Her definition, the renowned expert in the field, says, words that wound. She then defined psychological abuse are words and behaviors that undermine a child's sense of self and safety in the world. Members of the jury, if this doesn't undermine a child's sense of self, I don't know what does. To someone like Nicole Nachtman, who from an early age, as the records indicated, had been picked on in school, bullied, never able to make friends, never able to fit in, having attended 13 different schools in 13 years of school, because you can only go to school from 5 to 18. Kindergarten, you're about 5, you graduate high school in 18. 13 years and 13 different schools. Nicole needed a safe environment to come home to. She needed somewhere where her mother would protect and love her, not beat her down, and not damage her self-esteem even more. Miriam Dean's fat comments, fat shaming, you need LASIK, you need lipo, weigh yourself. Let's talk about these text messages, and this is State's Exhibit 70. You can go to page 335. You need to weigh yourself to get an idea where you are. At 5 feet, you should be 100 pounds. Add 5 pounds for every 1 inch after that. Get Bob to determine your height. So now Bob's involved. Those words, those actions by Miriam Deans for Nicole Nachtman were just as traumatizing as Miriam Deans just got a baseball bat and beat her with it every day. Dr. Heidi told you the most significant thing about words that wound and psychological abuse is when it comes from a parent. Your own mother. That's what makes it so damaging. How do we know the traumatizing effect Miriam Deans' actions and words had on Nicole? You saw a video of it yesterday. To this day, 4 years after her mother's death in 2019, she still sobs and bawls when she's talking about her mother. And she's describing these instances of abuse. In 2019, you saw on that video, it's like she's reliving it every time she has to talk about it. You saw it. I'd submit to you that's about the most genuine piece of evidence you've seen. The state has tried to minimize the abuse, minimize the traumatizing effect that it had on Nicole Nachtman. But that video speaks for itself. Dr. Heidi explained to you the 12 characteristics which are common in severely abused kids who kill their parents. She talked about the 12 characteristics with you, just to name a few: the pattern of family violence, the youth's attempt to obtain help from others fail, the youth's efforts to escape the family situation via suicide attempts, possibly running away. The youth is isolated. Home life becomes increasingly intolerable. The youth feels trapped and helpless. The youth loses control due to their inability to cope. The youth has no criminal history. A gun is available. And after the parent's death, it's a relief. These aren't 12 characteristics like Dr. Heidi came up with after evaluating Nicole Nachtman. These came out of a thoroughly researched book she authored several years ago. And guess who else agreed that those are common characteristics found in severely abused children who kill their parents? The state's doctor. Also keep in mind that by all accounts, Joseph Carey was stronger and more equipped to deal with his mother. He was able to stand up to her and run away as fast as he could from Virginia. He's now in the military with a family, successful. He was stronger and more equipped than Nicole Nachtman ever was. He ran away and never looked back. This is the same person who immediately after Nicole Nachtman's arrest, or prior to her arrest, but as he's talking to her on the phone, wants to call her immediately to make sure she's not going to harm herself. Who immediately after she's arrested contacts the family and says, we need to help her. We need to get her a lawyer. Because in his mind, he knew something had to have driven his sister to do this. He tells Nicole Nachtman, when law enforcement gets there, ask for a lawyer and do not talk. And what does she do? She does exactly what he tells her. A week after her arrest, or 2 weeks after her arrest, when he visits her in the jail, and you saw the video, he tells her, Nicole, do what makes you happy. Write in jail if you want. This person who had just killed his mother and shot her 3 times in a driveway, he's talking to and saying, Nicole, do what makes you happy. Don't worry about your weight. Don't worry about how you look in the mirror. Who now says 4 years later, if she had just called me, I would have helped her. If she had just called the family, they would have helped her. He saw how his mother treated his sister his entire life, the times he was around. He saw Nicole get liposuction. He saw changes in Nicole in middle school. She was being bullied. She wasn't the same. He told his mother. And so far, there's been absolutely no evidence that Miriam Deeds did anything. He saw how his mother belittled Nicole and called her fat. And he did nothing. When his mom said, oh, that's just the wrong friends, he accepted that. He'd take his sister in for a few weeks over the summer at his mom's request, but then send her back right to the same environment. Even the summer before this incident, in 2015, Nicole Nachtman spent 3 weeks with him in Washington State. And he told you, I noticed problems with her hygiene. I would have to tell her to bathe. She was hiding food. I had to drag her out of the room to take her places. And what does he do when the summer break is over? Sends her back to the home of Miriam Deans. He told you a story about something as silly as Nicole Nachtman buying a sword at a Renaissance festival. And she was petrified of her mom finding out. Now, I don't want to minimize the tragedy that Joseph Carey suffered when his mother was killed. However, his failure to acknowledge what was happening to his sister her entire childhood must be considered by you in evaluating his credibility. So let's talk about the family members who did try to intervene, who did see signs of Nicole's mental deterioration and abuse by her mother. Let's start with George Lear, Miriam Dean's brother. Now again, I am in no way minimizing that these men lost their sister, tragically. And I'm sure common sense tells everyone that they did not want to come into this courtroom and disparage their sister. They had no motive to do that. They had no interest in the case. But what did George Lear tell you? In 21 years of Nicole Nachtman's life, he saw Miriam Deans and Nicole be affectionate one time. Painting a house or something. Not at Christmas, not at Thanksgiving, not for a birthday party he may have attended for Nicole. One time in 21 years. George Lear wasn't just somebody who saw Nicole and Miriam every once in a while. He told you, I helped my mother with her. I would take her to school. I would drive her places. I would take her to the Air Academy or pick her up at the bus stop on the way back, on the way home on the weekends. I visited the apartment she lived in high school, where she lived by herself and slept on a mattress on the floor. So this wasn't somebody who was just seeing Nicole Nachtman every once in a while. And in 21 years, he saw Miriam Deans and Nicole Nachtman act like a mother and daughter should one time. More importantly, he told you about his observations about Nicole's fear of her mother. He told you that "don't tell mom" became the common phrase around the Lear house. Nicole's other uncle, Eric Lear, also told you. Same thing. Common sense tells us he didn't want to come in and disparage his sister. There's been no motive established on the part of Eric Lear. There's been no interest in how this case should be decided by anything that was brought out with Eric Lear. Eric Lear had the most contact, I'd say, out of all the brothers, or the uncles. Because he lived at his mother's home, Nicole's grandmother's home, off and on for periods throughout her childhood. He also told you he would drive his mother around because she didn't have a driver's license. So he spent a lot of time around Nicole during her childhood. His observations of Nicole are critical. From day one, when he spoke to the police, right after Nicole's arrest, he used the word bad. She looked like a battered woman. This wasn't after we had hired doctors and had opinions on battered child syndrome. This was at the time of Nicole's arrest. His description of Nicole Nachtman to police is she looks like a battered woman. He described how she's unkept, disheveled, smelled. He told police, I saw her talking to herself. I saw her talking to people who weren't there. Hiding food. He told you he told his sister his concerns, and she brushed them off and did nothing. That has been Eric Lear's testimony from the moment he talked to the police, in deposition, and in this week in trial. He told you about an incident at a restaurant after going ice skating just days before this incident. He told you they were sitting at a restaurant. Nicole was across the table in a booth, and she was literally had her head turned and she was talking to somebody that was not there. I'd submit to you, however, the most powerful thing Eric Clear told you was the incident at the mall where Nicole got lost. So he called his sister and said, Miriam, where's Nicole? Did she go home? Do you have her? He ends up finding Nicole in the mall, who had just wandered off to watch some performance. And when he tells Nicole, I just called your mother, he cried on the stand, describing that incident to you. He cried at the fear in Nicole Nachtman's eyes about her mother finding out that he had called her. Why is that important? Because you as the jury are now being asked not to decide what a typical 21-year-old would have done in these circumstances, but what Nicole Nachtman had been exposed to, her mental state, and what was going on in her mind. The judge is going to read you the law when we're done, and he's going to tell you that when determining or considering the justifiable use of deadly force, you must consider the facts and circumstances as they appear to Nicole Nachtman. The years of psychological abuse, the fear of her mother finding out something so small like, I got lost in the mall. That's how you're to judge this case. The circumstances that were apparent to Nicole Nachtman. You must also consider the facts in the case. The open bedroom window. The front door of the house when police do the welfare check, that's slightly open, and Miriam's purse and bag just on the floor right when you walk in. The medical examiner's testimony, who said all 3 shots, nothing, he didn't testify anything was a significant distance away. He said 1 shot was less than 2 feet away, and I actually demonstrated, and that's muzzle to wound. And that all he can say about the other 2 shots to Miriam Deans is that they were more than 2 feet away, and no other opinions as to that. We have an individual who jumped out of a bedroom window to avoid seeing her mother. Those are all facts you must consider in determining what Nicole Nachtman was thinking at the time she killed her mother. You must evaluate this case based on the circumstances as they appeared to her. A person who was mentally ill, psychotic, delusional, and who still to this day believed her mom was going to kill her. You must consider everything Nicole Nachtman endured as a child. The years of abuse, her mental state. But what you're being asked to do is not evaluate her mental state on those phone calls Miss Derry played, or her mental state 4 years later in 2019, or even her mental state 2 hours after the incident. The law is clear. It's her mental state at the time of the offenses. Dr. Heidi, a renowned expert in the area of kids who kill parents. She's testified in 6 published one of the leading authorities in this area. She told you that in over 30 years of being a college professor, she has never seen anyone as impaired as Nicole Nachtman. She admitted to you this is not the most severe case of physical abuse I've ever seen. But that's not what's important. What's important is how the psychological and verbal abuse affected Nicole Nachtman. How it affected her in terms of her development, her maturity, her ability to stick up to her mother, her ability to care for herself and navigate through college. The fact that Nicole Nachtman wasn't beaten with a bat till she was unconscious in no way minimizes the traumatizing effect that that abuse had on her. Dr. Heidi repeatedly said during her testimony, when asked by Mr. Terry, it's not what a rational person would think or believe. It's what Nicole Nachtman thought or believed. Nicole Nachtman wasn't acting like a rational person in August of 2015. She had already been deteriorating, by all accounts, since her trip back from London in 2013. She was failing. She hadn't secured a dorm. She had lost her bike. Now, these things might sound trivial to most people. But you're not in the trial of most people. You're being asked to determine Nicole Nachtman's state of mind. All of those stressors in Nicole's mind, and remember, Dr. Heidi continuously used the term child to describe Nicole. It was like she was a child. You saw evidence of her talking about Snow Queen. You saw Elsa books that she had. There's even, I think, a pair of Elsa blue slippers in one of the photos. This wasn't the mind of a normal 21-year-old. This was the mind of a child. While rational people, people without a mental illness who didn't get their dorm, may not think that's a huge deal. Rational people without a mental illness may not think failing out of college is a big deal. But in Nicole Nachtman's mind, these stressors caused her to have a psychotic break. That's not me telling you. That's what the evidence and the mental health professionals told you. Dr. Heidi's observations and opinions, I'd submit to you, are critical. And the reason that is because she is the only mental health professional in this case that saw Nicole 8 days after her arrest. She told you that Nicole was still psychotic and delusional during her 6-hour evaluation of Nicole Nachtman in September of 2015. The state has repeatedly made reference to the fact that Nicole is not a battered child. She's not abused because her mom provided for her basic needs. Members of the jury, those of us that are parents, know that parenting involves so much more than food and shelter. Parenting requires nurturing. It requires encouragement. It requires a safe environment that your child who's being bullied at school can come home to. I want you to look at the state's Exhibit 48, which is in evidence. It's the phone records that they introduced. They're not long. But they span the dates of August 2nd through August 12th, which is kind of that time frame just before these instances. I want you to count. the number of times Nicole called her mother. She called her mother 44 times. Her mom called her 13 times. The state made a point to show these text messages, State's Exhibit 70. She was putting money in her bank. She was providing for Nicole. I'm not exactly sure how many pages there are, but you're going to have it back there. And I want you to look at those text messages and count how many times the word love is used by Miriam Deans. These text messages span a much longer period. They spanned January of 2015 until August of 2015. That's 8 months. I'll save you some time because there isn't one single text that has the word love in it from Miriam Deans to her daughter in 8 months. You're going to find one text that has the word love in it, and it was on June 30th, 2015, and it was Nicole telling her mother she loved her. You know what the response was? Nothing. Your daughter is away at school in Tallahassee, 4 hours away. And we got hundreds of pages here of text messages. Weigh yourself. Don't forget. Not one text message, Nicole, I love you. And when Nicole says, Mom, I love you, nothing. The state made a point to bring David Lear back yesterday. They introduced 3 photographs that David Lear apparently had accumulated. The first set of photographs were of Nicole. I think he said the oldest was about 3 or 4. And she's with her mom and she's happy. That has never been in dispute. That in her early years, she's smiling. But where are the pictures of Nicole Nachtman and Miriam Deans at Christmas?
Do we object? Approach bench?
Yeah, you approach, absolutely.
Were you provided about Christmas, Thanksgiving, birthday parties? The Rose, who lived next door and would hear or could see or hear the pool area of the Lear or the Dean's residence. Never heard about any barbecues, Sunday family dinners. That's what a child needs from their mother. Love, encouragement, affection. Let's talk about the experts. The most important fact that you heard in this trial from all 3 mental health professionals is that Nicole falls on the schizophrenia spectrum of disorders. All 3 said it. Dr. Ewing told you that he evaluated Nicole and came up with his opinions before he read Dr. Heidi's report. So he does his evaluation, he reviews the history and records, and then, which is appropriate, I'm not going to review the opinions of another mental health professional until I myself have formulated mine. And they come with the same exact diagnosis of schizophrenia for Nicole. Their opinions that she's a battered child, again, coincide. They showed you in the DSM-5 the diagnostic criteria they used for that diagnosis. And they went through each and every criteria and how it applied to Nicole, which is what a psychologist or psychiatrist is supposed to do. They told you about the delusions, the hallucinations, the disorganized speech, the disorganized behavior, the negative symptoms, the inappropriate affect, the disturbed sleep pattern, But they didn't just come up with this opinion out of the sky. They based it on records, they based it on accounts by family, and they based it on accounts by the people in college who were observing Nicole close in time to these offenses. Angelica Henwood, Jackie Roman, Laura Hessemer, Eric Lear. They told you this was a gradual process of mental deterioration in Nicole Nachtman. Dr. Ewing defined for you what auditory hallucinations are, and he provided authority in a medical journal that the screaming in her head from London is an auditory hallucination. So why is the state doctor the only one who came on the other side of that spectrum? So she's on that schizotypal, if you remember the diagram, to the left. And everybody else is on the right. Schizophrenia, the most severe mental illness in the field. I'll tell you why. Because she stands to lose the $480,000 she has received from their office in the last several years. If she says schizophrenia, she loses work. If she says schizophrenia, she loses her $480,000 she could then earn in the next several years. Now, I'd submit to you that no one in this courtroom is unsympathetic to children who are abused. But our job is to defend Nicole Nachtman. But we had to ask Dr. Lazaro about her own childhood. It's not because we're not unsympathetic people. It's not because we don't recognize how important child abuse is. We've been talking about it for 2 weeks. But we had to ask her because in a case involving child abuse, where she says our client is not battered or not abused, her childhood is absolutely relevant. You know why? Because in Dr. Lazaro's mind, she turned out fine. She was abused, but she became a doctor. Not everyone's like Dr. Lazaro, and that's why we had to bring it out. Because her bias is based on her own experiences, not those of Nicole Nachtman. One of your fellow jurors in jury selection said it perfect. When we were talking about mental illness and Ms. Holt was questioning the panel, one juror says, you have to look at the individual. Not everybody had the genetic makeup Nicole Nachtman did. Not everybody had the low self-esteem Nicole Nachtman did. You have to look at the individual. Let's talk a little bit about what the state doctor told you yesterday. She was asked if Nicole's account of her mother banging her head on a table was abuse. And her response was, if it was me, I would have just counseled the parent. A third grader who is being banged, her head is being banged on a table. Now she said, I don't dispute that didn't happen. She's going to counsel the parent. She told you that Nicole just has a personality flaw. And that Miriam Deans just had a parenting style. You're fat. You need lipo. You're a skank. You need to weigh yourself. Kicking Nicole into a fireplace until she could feel it on her back. Nicole finding a gun and pills, and Miriam's response is to show her how to use the gun. I'm not sure what kind of parenting style that is. It's abuse. if you believe the state doctor's characterization of discipline and abuse, and she testified to it at the very beginning, what she basically said is, it's discipline and not abuse as long as it's in response to something the child does. So according to the state doctor, if a child takes the car, runs away, uses drugs, and a parent beats them over the head with a bat, that's not abuse because it's in response to something the child did. That's what she told you yesterday. I'm also not sure which record she reviewed. Because what she testified to yesterday is not what you heard in this courtroom. She told you that a roommate said Nicole was capable of caring for herself in college, she just chose not to. Unless I was in a different courtroom this week and last week, I missed that. Because every single person that encountered Nicole Nachtman in college that testified in this courtroom said she could not care for herself. I had to throw her mattress outside. I had talks with her, and she wasn't getting it. She told you yesterday that Joey Carey said that when Nicole stayed with him that summer in Washington prior to these offenses, that she could care for herself. Again, I must have missed that. Because Joseph Carey said I had to tell her when to bathe. I had to drag her places. She was sneaking food. The state doctor, however, did use words like aggressive, demeaning, when describing how Miriam Deans talked to Nicole Nachtman. But just said, I just didn't agree with her parenting. She also said, it's not my judgment to make. You were hired to determine if Nicole Nachtman was abused and suffered from battered child syndrome, and it's not your judgment to make as to the parenting Miriam Deans exhibited. She testified Nicole is a meek person, that Miriam Deans' words were clearly hurtful to Nicole. So I guess if you decide to believe or give credence to the state doctor, her opinion is that Nicole Nachtman killed both of her parents because she didn't fit in, she liked to binge eat, she liked to overspend, and it was just a personality flaw. The state doctor knew before she ever went and saw Nicole Nachtman that doctors were saying she had schizophrenia. She knew that they had opined that Nicole was insane at the time of these offenses. She knows what the diagnostic criteria is for schizophrenia. She had the benefit of Eric Lear's deposition, who said, I saw her talking to herself. But her answer yesterday was, I just didn't ask Nicole about it. You've been given a diagnosis of schizophrenia. You know that delusions and hallucinations are part of the criteria to diagnose somebody. And your answer to that question is, I didn't ask Nicole about it? I'll let you make sense of that. I think the question many have asked is, why Robert Deans? I go back to my original statement when I stood up here earlier. Kids, teenagers, college students, they don't kill their parents for no reason. They don't wake up one day with a master plan, as the state has tried to suggest, to kill their parents. What do we know about Robert Deans? Not a single person in the Lear family knew anything about him. If he ever went to Miriam Dean's mother's home, Nicole's grandmother's home, maybe once, Joseph Carey, Miriam Dean's son, met him or hung out with him or spent time with him 4 times in their 11-year marriage. When they got married in 2004, Nicole would have been 8 years old. There was no testimony from a single witness that there was ever family dinners that Robert Deans attended, Christmases, Thanksgivings. None of the photos that you've seen have Robert Deans and Nicole in them. And all those times you heard Miriam Deans was deployed or had to work, not once did anyone say Nicole stayed with him. She lived in an apartment by herself in high school while Robert Deans lived in Harrowwood. She slept on a mattress. What Robert Deans did is he failed to protect Nicole from her mother. At the age of 8, when he entered Nicole's life, children bond with their step-parents. You heard Wesley Rowe, the neighbor, talk about his stepdaughter, Elizabeth. In fact, he called her daughter and then had to correct himself and said stepdaughter. Within this very trial, you saw evidence of what a stepfather and stepdaughter's relationship should be. That is not the case with Robert Deans and Nicole Nachtman. A retired police officer who was in the military did nothing to protect Nicole. In fact, that text message I just referenced where Miriam Deans says, "Have Bob weigh you." Step-parents have a duty to protect their children just like biological parents, just like adopted parents. And the final thing I want to say about Robert Deans is somebody who is in their right mind doesn't sit in a house for 24 hours with the decomposing body of her stepfather if everything is just perfect. Ms. Derry addressed the law of premeditation with you, and I want to talk about that for purposes of first-degree murder. They're suggesting to you that this was some sort of master plan by Nicole Nachtman. The same person who you heard couldn't navigate the jail visitation from Dr. Heidi, couldn't figure out what to do when her bike went missing, talked about the Snow Queen to Detective Messer, forgot to get housing even though she was an upperclassman. So she'd done it before. It had been done before for her. So this master plan, as they want you to believe, to support premeditation, was, as they stated, shooting Bob in the head, wrapping him in a comforter, and then dragging him into a bedroom. Now what? This master plan of shooting her mother in the driveway where neighbors and people can hear gunshots and call the police. This master plan of driving to Tallahassee and checking into the very dorm that everyone knew she was headed to or was supposed to be at. And then on the phone call Ms. Derry played for you, telling Detective Messer her address of where he can come find her. Detective Messer, in that phone call that was played for you earlier, even says, "I'm surprised you answered." She answers the phone and says, "I just don't know my exact address," because she's moving in and doesn't know the dorm, which is not unreasonable. looks it up and gives him the exact place he can find her. Oh, and then let me go to my cousin David's house and borrow money and tell him exactly where I'm going to be too, so the police can find me there. Now, the state made a big deal throughout this trial about the car down the street, laying in wait, the GPS coordinates. But Elena Rowe, the neighbor, told you that when she went out for a run that night, she saw Nicole Nachtman's car parked right in front of their house at 8:15 p.m. because she almost walked into it. Now, the state attempted to say, well, you didn't tell the police that. And what did she tell you? I couldn't get into my house, and my family was telling me they heard gunshots. I was thinking about a few other things than whether I saw Nicole Nachtman's car or not. But as soon as she did, she reported it. The law also says that anything Nicole may have done after the fact. All these things Miss Derry spent a significant amount of time talking to you about, cleaning up, putting things in the washer. Remember this, because the law says you cannot consider what happened after the offenses to determine premeditation. That's very, very important to remember. What Nicole Nachtman did after shooting Robert Deans and Miriam Deans cannot be considered at all by you on the issue of premeditation. Because premeditation is something that happens before. Members of the jury, you were chosen in this case because in jury selection, we asked each and every one of you if you could consider mental illness, if you could consider abuse, if you could consider the defense of insanity, if you could consider the defense of justifiable use of deadly force. And each and every one of you promised us you would. So what do we have to establish for insanity? You've seen this already, but just to review. A person is, first of all, the first sentence is very important. It's whether Nicole Nachtman was insane when the crime allegedly was committed. A person is considered to be insane when she had a mental infirmity, disease, or defect. We already know that nobody disputes number one exists. Even the state doctor says she's mentally ill. And two, because of this condition, she did not know what she was doing or its consequences. And there you stop. You don't need to read any more into B, because that's not what we're proceeding under. And that's why there's an or there. It's A or B. Now, the state elicited testimony yesterday about did she know it was wrong to kill somebody? That's prong B, and that's not for your consideration. So let's talk about the evidence in the case that shows that Nicole Nachtman did not know what she had done or its consequences. Detective Messer himself said that he arrives at the Florida State University Police Department to question Nicole Nachtman about 2 counts of first-degree murder. She already knows he's coming. You heard the phone call. And she's exactly where they find her. He's about to question her about the killing of her parents. And within minutes of walking into the room, Nicole Nachtman starts telling him about the Snow Queen. He even stops her at one point and says, "You know your mom is dead, right? You know Bob is dead, right?" Her response is, "Yeah, I'm just trying to distract myself," and goes right back to talking. Now, Detective Messer didn't want to admit the first time when I asked him until I confronted him with his deposition. But in his mind, he believed she was not grasping what was happening. Now, the state contends that that video somehow portrays something else. But Detective Messer was in the room. And he told you, as he previously did in a deposition under sworn testimony, that she was not grasping what was happening. She was not grasping the seriousness of the situation. What other evidence do you have to suggest that Nicole Nachtman did not know the consequences of what she had done? She told Dr. Heidi that there were 4 possibilities or resolutions to her case. 1, she could be tortured. 2, she could be banished from society. 3, she would donate money to all of you all's choice for a charity. 4, she would keep a journal of her behavior. And then finally, she used the term 4, but then she followed up and said she wanted to join the military. What did she tell her brother in the jail visit? I'm going to buy you Christmas presents when I get out. This is a 21-year-old who has low personality development, is immature, is psychotic, is mentally ill, and she is not grasping what she had done or its consequences. Now, Ms. Holt discussed this in jury selection, but I want to bring it up because there's 2 different burdens in this case. And we talked at length during jury selection about the burden of proof. And that as to the elements of premeditation and the elements of first-degree murder, the burden of proof by the state of Florida is beyond and to the exclusion of all reasonable doubt. But our burden for insanity is much lower, and that's in the instruction. It's by clear and convincing evidence. It's right here in this paragraph. It defines what clear and convincing evidence is. Remember, it's not beyond and to the exclusion of all reasonable doubt like they must prove to you for first-degree murder. Clear and convincing evidence is evidence that is precise, explicit, lacking in confusion, and of such weight that it produces a firm belief without hesitation about the matter in issue. You had 2 trained, credible mental health professionals telling you that they believed Nicole Nachtman was insane at the time of these offenses, and unlike the state doctor, based those opinions on fact and evidence. Mental illness affects people differently. Insanity at the time of the offense doesn't mean Nicole Nachtman needs to sit here in a straitjacket. Dr. Ewing told you about a colleague of his who was a Yale Law School graduate and professor who suffers from schizophrenia. But what Dr. Ewing told you is what Nicole suffers from is the most severe mental illness there is. You have been asked to make a very important decision in this case, and that's whether Nicole Nachtman is not guilty by reason of insanity. I want to read you the bottom of this instruction that the judge is going to tell you. It's the last paragraph. If your verdict is that the defendant is not guilty by reason of insanity, that does not necessarily mean she will be released from custody. I, the judge, must conduct further proceedings to determine if the defendant should be committed to a mental hospital or given other outpatient treatment or released. The law says that is not for your consideration what happens to Nicole after this trial. You're to determine if you believe she had a mental disease or defect and that because of schizophrenia, she didn't know what she was doing or its consequences. That's it. Judge Sabella, who has presided over this case, who has heard all the evidence and all the facts, will take all of that into consideration in determining what happens with Nicole Nachtman should you find her not guilty by reason of insanity. So do not let that cloud your judgment. On the issue of insanity, the state made a point to say that Nicole Nachtman told her brother, "I'll miss you." She hugged David and said goodbye. She told Laura, "You've been a good friend." I submit to you that that was her suicidal thoughts. You heard evidence that, in fact, during this entire ordeal, she's suicidal. She's contemplating killing herself. She's contemplating what she's going to do about housing. She is psychotic and delusional. Members of the jury, if you apply what you've heard these past 2 weeks, and I mean everything you've heard, all of the witness accounts, her childhood, the records, the college students, the family, the mental health experts, the credible ones, the only verdict supported by the facts, the law, and the evidence is one of not guilty by reason of insanity as to both counts. Because when Nicole Nachtman shot Robert Deans and Miriam Deans, she was psychotic, she was delusional, she was schizophrenic, and she did not know what she was doing or its consequences. Thank you.
Ms. Hershey, can I get you to move the thing just so I can ask the jury? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've been sitting there for 2 hours now. We're going to go to the state's rebuttal argument, but I just want to know if any of you need a quick restroom break or break to stretch your legs. I see, yes, okay. I sense more than enough. I only needed one. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a short break. Please do not discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Please do not do any research related to the case, and please avoid any exposure to reports of the case outside the courtroom. All stand for the jury. Jury has exited. Everyone may be seated. I don't normally have to do that in closings, but they had been there for 2 hours and they all wanted a break. So we'll go ahead and take, let's give them 15 minutes. It takes them a while since there's only one restroom in there. So take 15 minutes. We'll come back. What that does is then I intend to go right into instructions. If I didn't give them that break, I was going to give them an instruction. I was going to give them a break for instructions. But I intend to go right into instructions after the rebuttal.